Welcome to the third round of the Rapid Tournament in Switzerland. Now we are playing very solid Candidate Master, who is rated around 2100. We are currently 2 out of 2, and in the third round, we have very hard match. So we started, and I opened the game with e4. He was thinking for a bit and responded with Sicilian defense. Played my classical knight f3, and now he picked Taimano variation e6, where I respond with g3 move. So this sideline is very interesting because it's provoking black to go directly for d5, which leads to e takes, pawn takes, and now we can go d4. There's even some options to go bishop b5. But he actually went for a6. He is also a Can Sicilian player, so we could understand this setup from him. Played bishop g2, he played the knight c6, and then I castled. So where I actually want to transpose, I want to transpose into the King's Indian attack if he opted for d5 and knight f6, but he decided to go for g6, which is slightly inaccurate here because it seems like he played so many pawn moves in the opening, and how you can actually punish that as white here, what you should do. I know that d4 directly works, but I remember that I was playing some online games where after bishop g7, knight takes, b takes, I played in that game f4 move, and I remember that this is not great move. And at this point, I know that white is having definitely advantage since the d6 square could be targeted by my bishop, my queen, and so on. But firstly, I need to develop my pieces. And I remember that according to engine f4 is a bad move. I remember that line. So I didn't want to opt for d4 variation. I actually know that this works very well, but I didn't have a feeling for that in this game. So I was thinking now a little bit and trying to figure out something else here. Maybe I should start with rook e1 or some ideas like with knight c3, knight e5, but that barely works because he'll quickly develop and go castles. So I decided to go for c3, which is another approach and punishment for this g6, bishop g7, and then d4. So this actually direct striking in the middle. If takes and d5, we're gonna just take on d5, and if pawn takes, there is rook e1 and the center is opening. Also the pawn on d5 all becomes more soft. He took, I took back, and he needs development, but seems like knight from g2 e7 runs in some problems. That's why I reacted like that. d5 now is a very strong move, and I saw it on the spot, but I was looking, maybe there could be something else. Ideas such as d6 closing the bishop is also interesting, and providing some knight jumps, but this is called initiative. You should directly proceed with the attack on your opponent, especially when his king in the middle is not castled. That's why d5 is very strong. He played knight to e5, offering the trade. And by trading this knight here, the bishop gets out, and that's usually a bad sign because later on he actually need to bring this bishop back at some point, which wastes the time. Also, trading here is opening up our bishop, and that's definitely not a great idea for black. That's why he took back, and white is much better here, but we have to be precise with our moves to keep the advantage. For example, now many people would go here move f4, which is totally possible. This allows some check, queen b6, king h1, and bishop takes b2. We have to be really careful here to not lose some material. That's why I didn't want to proceed with f4. I didn't like that move. In the past, maybe I would play that kind of move, or on bullet or blitz game. Looks very attractive, I can agree with you. But you have to be steady when you're playing rapid game because there is so many time on clock. That's why I play knight c3. If he wants to take, I'm preferring that trade because he'll lose the control over the dark squares. He castled actually. And here we need to increase the pressure on dark squares. Like bishop h6 is a very nice move, where most probably he could play bishop g7 and trade that piece. Why not to trade dark square bishop? Seems like a very strong defender over the king side, and also, that's the purpose why g6, e6, a6, all of these pawn moves at the same time in opening is not great for black. That's the reason why I played the move bishop g5. Now I'm provoking another weakness, and that's f6. Keeping this bishop in middle there, I would play something like bishop to h6. He'll play most probably rook e8 or rook f7. And now the ideas of f4 could appear on the board. Also, I like how this bishop is disconnected from king. On the other side, f6 move is played. The e6 becomes more soft. And this is a great strategy how to provoke your opponent to create more weaknesses. So that's why he's thinking now. He's doubting, should he play the move f6, or maybe he should opt for some b5 or d6, trying to open up the light square bishop. Also, knight is restricted on e7. Even though, let's say, they protect and move the queen, knight is very much restricted. He can't jump in the middle. That's why he decided to go for d6, trying to open up the bishop to get developed, of course. f4 is always good looking move on the first glance, but you have to be careful how you're pushing that one. That's why I just forgot about that move, unless I have some tactics, because I know that f4 is exposing my king and allows some little counterplay, which I didn't want to allow, especially with tempo. So d6, normal logical move. Now what should white do here is to look for rook connection and to play something like queen d2 and connecting the rooks, putting them on open potential lines like c1, d1, or maybe depends what happens in the middle, or d1, e1. Before that, before I play queen d1, queen d2 here, I decided to take a look at d takes e6 here, because if I want to attack on the c and d line, then I have to be sure that he won't close it. And if I take back with pawn, like why I would need my rook on the d line then? So always firstly decide where you want to place your rooks, where you think the rooks could be mostly effective and what they can do. Like, is it e line or d line or c line? And then plan, like don't go firstly with rooks. Firstly decide if there's any trades in the middle, if you understand me, and then proceed with your final decision. That's why I decided firstly to take. Maybe according to engine is not the best look, because after bishop takes e6 he kind of developed, but also this pawn becomes soft. I got really surprised because he retook with a pawn, and now I definitely have the vision where my rook's gonna stay. Like definitely that will be rook d1 and rook c1, like pressuring d6 and pressuring the c line here, that's for sure. On the other side, this diagonal could be problematic. When I move the knight, b pawn could be hanging in all these scenarios. So now, as I mentioned, I would like to connect my rooks to improve my position, and that's the reason why I played the move queen d2. Also, I want some bishop h6, maybe followed by f4. Who knows, even f5, e5 sacrifices could work here. He's kind of stuck. Doesn't have good and great angle for defense. Here, bishop d7 for black, followed by some rook f7, rook c8. He needs to play passive now because he has a lot of weaknesses, and this bishop definitely creates the problems. I can bring my bishop back and then maybe go something like f4. Here f4 directly does not work because there is always check, and after this he'll just move the bishop away. And then anyway, pawn on d6 is protected. So whenever you push your pawns, be aware what you are to actually protect anything behind or not. That could be decent counterplay for your opponent. He decided to propose trade on f6, which is another mistake, because I told you that bishop on g7 is very important defender, drawing the dark squares, and after rook takes, there is simple move here, e5, which wins the pawn because pawn cannot take, queen d8 happens. I saw that directly, but then I found some other option, which is rook from a to d1. But this move doesn't work because e5 happens, and now rook is protecting the d6. Of course, white is still better, has tremendous advantage, but this e5 is just much easier, wins the pawn on the spot, and creates more advantage for white. But rook d1 is also very possible. So that's why I was stopped here for a moment and trying to understand, is there anything better? Maybe even f4 followed by, rook d1, rook e1 could work, but I just decided to go e5. That's the most straightforward line. This attacks the rook and the pawn at the same time. So now rook f7, rook f8, pretty much the most logical two moves. I would say rook f8 to protect the queen, but then the pawn falls here, and now it's really interesting. How do we retake on d6? Do we retake with pawn or do we retake the queen? Do we actually opt for the endgame here or not? Then he decided to go for rook f8. And at that point, as I mentioned, we can take with pawn, we can take with queen. Depends what is your preference. I decided to take with queen because endgame seems to be very nice. Like rook d1, rook e1 will happen. And that way we are going to protect the pawn and the other rook will pressure the other pawn here on e6. Also, this bishop is beautiful, targeting the b7 pawn where it's kind of delaying development for black. He decided to take, I take back. He played knight f5, I protect the pawn, and he autopilot the move bishop d7, which gives me option to take the pawn on b7. I know that gives some little counterplay for black, rook b8, but I just took another pawn, and after rook takes b2, I'm 2 pawns up, but I have to be careful that this pawn here could be hanging. And here it's a very interesting situation. I suddenly started thinking so much and spending time because I didn't like the activity of the rooks that could come, and also my knight is hanging, my bishop is bad, poorly coordinated. I don't have time for bishop c4, there's rook c2. Also, he does have some counterplay on f2, so I have to be careful how I'm playing this. Like if I play something like rook e1, I'm not particularly threatening to black anything. He'll move the knight maybe and create some threats on f2. Rook c2 is threatening the knight, then after that pawn on a2. So my plan should be to somehow bring the knight to c5 and target the defender or the 7th rank, then my generally pass pawn, which creates the trouble. So I have to focus on this angle here. I don't want to focus on a2 pawn. That's the reason why I spent so much time here. And I think here I played the best move in the position, that's rook b1. Simply I want to bring this rook into the game and try to trade this. So if he takes, I'll take obviously back with my rook. Or at least if he plays rook b8, we'll trade a pair of rooks and the other rook will come on d1 or e1, trying to activate another piece. Also, I'm fine with trading. He played rook b8. And that was kind of obvious. Now, I don't have time for like bishop c4 or something. Still, he has some take and rook c8 ideas to, pin, depends how I retake. Also, pawn on d6 could hang. So now it's a very important moment for white to not blunder something and allow black to equalize the game. For some reason, I spent so much time here in this early middle game actually. I'm doubting many stuff here now because it seems like I have a lot of options, but also position is not totally clear. I decided to take the rook on b2. He takes back. And I move knight e4. So I thought to protect my knight this way. For some reason I'm not happy here, but white is winning. I thought that he could actually handle this pressure around the d6 e6 square. I think that this rook can provide enough balance in the game, and because my rook is not ready to counterplay, he already has takes and attacking my bishop and so on. Also king f7 will come closer maybe to support a pawn, or if needed king e8 to support a bishop. That's the main reason why I didn't like on the first glance this position. But move after move is getting more precise. So he took the pawn on a2, targeting my bishop. I dropped my bishop back to c4 and he played rook to a7. Here I was thinking if he goes for something like rook a4, I would try this knight f6 check, and if he plays king f7, he is automatically losing because after knight takes d7, he's not time for rook takes c4 because there is knight f5. So practically on this check, he has to play something like king g7 or king f. Okay, king f8 doesn't work because of knight takes d7, but king g7 for sure. And now I have to take, he takes back, and to rely on this endgame to win, like knight e5, rook d1, and to push. So instead, he played rook a7, now I played rook d1, under the minute already, protecting the pawn, and now I'm threatening, obviously, knight to f6. Also, knight c5 is a threat, another threat. At this point, my opponent is hesitating how to defend against knight f6. Does he want to play king f7 or king g7? I think that's on his mind. What's the difference between these two moves? I think difference is also, okay, king f7 protects the pawn, but it's also stepping into some checks, you know, like knight g5 or knight c5 and so on. So he is doubting about that. I mean, maybe he wants to see this trade because later rook will attack the pawn together with knight. So he doesn't mind, for the instance, in the moment to face knight f6. He played h6. Now I played king g2. Just trying to move something and get some time. He played king f7. And now he wanted to protect g5 square. That's the purpose of h6. 40 seconds on clock for me. Will I handle this position with very low time on clock? Also, there is some ideas of knight c5, knight takes e6 followed by d7. That's what I spotted. And that's the reason why I play knight c5. I don't mind this check on c6. I can even play f3. I can even drop my king back. That's not a big problem here. Now he's facing also problem with this bishop. Can't move the rook. Can't move the knight properly. Because if he moves the knight somewhere, then I will take, rook takes, and maybe some bishop b5. It's also very important for white to not go for urgency here and trading or something, because position could be very drawish if that happened. So I have to be careful with all these critical decisions. If I want to keep the advantage, I need to keep pressuring. And then in the right moment, when it's time to trade, then I'll trade and win the game. Now black is kind of out of moves. He's in a zugzwang. Also, I have idea of rook e1 and then taking on e6. That's another one. But for that, I need to move the knight because knight will take my pawn here, and that's something I don't want to happen. Like if I go rook e1, then after knight takes d6, I think then the threat of this is happening, and maybe it's a draw. So he played g5, and he blundered with that because I want my tactic knight takes e6. If bishop takes e6, the point is d7, and he can't take the pawn either with rook or bishop because I'm providing pin, and he's not in time to provide additional counterplay because I provide a queen here, and of course white is simply winning. So after knight takes e6, black is almost lost, but he can still try something, maybe to survive. He has some checks here. Maybe rook can come into the game. And maybe he can rely on my time if I blunder because I have 26 seconds on clock, which is not good for this moment. You know, many people would collapse and miss the win here. And the problem would definitely be the time because they didn't have great time management during the game. I spent so much time, more than my opponent, but also my opponent didn't play precise and he were rushing at some point where he actually should think how to develop his pieces. He played king f6, and now I have to move my knight out of the way. It's time. So I just brought it back to c5, target the bishop here. So I'm 2 pawns up now, but the game is still not over. If he wins the pawn on d6, then theoretically 3 versus 2 could be a draw. So he gave me a check. I played bishop d5. I don't mind this trade now because at this point I'm still saving my pawn on d6. So bishop, if he takes my bishop, then my rook takes, and later on I'm ready to push. That's why he brought a bishop back to d7. And now, since I wanna again protect my pawn on d6, I drop the bishop on f3. So it's safer to have it on this diagonal now because it's also protecting my king. And on the other side, I'm stopping any sort of h5 g4 push. There's some interesting tactic here, maybe like g4, and if I take, he might play something like knight e3, but that's barely working. He played king e5. I was surprised he allowed me the check on d5, and after king f6, I saw winning combination, and that's taking the bishop, rook takes, and bishop g4, that wins the knight on f5. Knight takes, rook takes, and after bishop g4, game is pretty much over because after rook takes, there's just rook takes f5, and if the knight takes d6, there's just bishop takes d7, and he cannot additionally protect the knight. Even if he can, we're gonna just trade everything, and pawn endgame is also winning. So that's the moment where I got relaxed because I know there is no comeback for him. He took, I took the knight, he played king g6, I played rook to a5, he pushed h5, I gave a check, he moved the king, and I played bishop e4, where he actually resigned the game. So we are proceeding in the 4th round with 3 points out of 3, which is amazing result, especially on these tournaments when you are top seed all the time and you have to face lower rated opponents. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Nem sokan